Hello there and a very good morning and welcome to a brand new edition of Newsline. We're coming to you live from our Newsfirst studios here in Colombo. I'm Sonali Wanika-Baduge and joining us this morning is Kamini Jinadasa. She's a gender consultant. Good morning, Kamini.
Good morning,
and thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Kamini, when we speak about gender-based violence and gender studies, traditionally we always seem to think that it's violence against women that we're talking about. How has the conversation really shifted?
Well, I mean, just to explain why it is that we always talk about women, it's because, and women and girls, it's because they have a, in terms of those who experience gender-based violence, it's women who have a higher propensity to experience violence. And amongst them, though, men and also transgender people also experience violence. And so now you do see with the work around, say, engaging men and boys work and things like that, that the conversation is starting to shift where people are beginning to understand how men also experience violence and seeing the interconnection between men's experiences with violence and perpetration of violence, perhaps by them, even in the future.
Has there been a national level study conducted in Sri Lanka to assess how many men, how many women are victims of gender-based violence?
Unfortunately, in terms of data around women and women's experiences of violence, we haven't conducted a national level study. There is something that has been done in many countries called the WHO multi-country study, which is a really super tool which helps you collect a lot of data, which helps inform national policy and national legislation all over the world. So yes, unfortunately we don't have national data on women. We do have pocket studies, we do have quantitative studies perhaps done in various districts or qualitative studies where the statistics show something around the range of 30% to 60% of perpetration of intimate partner violence against women. In terms of men, Care International conducted a groundbreaking study in 2013. The name of the study is Broadening Gender Why Masculinities Matter. And for that they used tools from the WHO multi-country study and conducted a study in 4 districts where they were able to collect information around men's perpetration of violence, and not only that, also their own experiences of violence and what are the things that kind of drive men to perpetrate violence, what are the risk factors, what are the causal factors, really going a bit more in-depth instead of just having very general statements about why men perpetrate violence.
Kamini, what's the point of conducting studies if thereafter there is no action taken to put these recommendations of studies to practice?
It is a challenge, but the thing is, unfortunately, we live in a society where unless there's solid evidence, people are so anecdotal in their approach. They say, oh yeah, even though you're talking about violence against women, I experience violence, or as a man I've experienced violence, and what are you talking about? And people tend to disregard information around violence against women and girls and the data. So I think not only people working in the field of gender, but also academics and politicians play an important role in holding data and making it important. Because you see in other countries where data from, say, WHO multi-country study has really driven change in terms of policy, in terms of legislation, in terms of, I mean, for example, creating shelters for women. One of my roles is to work with the Ministry of Women's Affairs as a consultant, and I've been going around various parts of the country. And while we have only a handful of shelters for women, when we go to each district, there's a request for shelters for women. And it's not only women who are affected, their children are also affected by violence. So they also need to be in a safer space. So you find the ministry making commitments in terms of, okay, maybe we'll take steps to try and put up a shelter. But if you have the prevalence rates properly documented for the entire country, you don't need to wait till you go to a district to have that conversation to put up shelters. You will know, okay, so there's a concentration of domestic violence or intimate partner violence in this particular area. This area needs a shelter. I think some of the success stories, though, around data collation has been, once again, the CARE study. That was used a lot to drive policy change within the universities. And as a direct result of that study, a policy on preventing sexual gender-based violence in universities was developed. I'm not too sure where it is at the moment, but there was, once again, a lot of people got involved. It wasn't only people like us who are activists, but also academics, people in universities, the politicians, and who used the data to push the issue. I mean, we know that, say, for example, in universities, there is a high rate of sexual gender-based violence. Sure. Take it from ragging to what happens when you're second, third, fourth year. So there are success stories, but very few. But good data is required to really push the story home so that no one can question it.
How true is the statement that the abused go on to become abusers later on in their lives?
There is a high possibility of men who have experienced, say, child abuse or witnessed abuse amongst their parents, or, say, violence against their mother, to perpetrate violence as they grow older. Studies have shown this. Unfortunately, though, there are no studies that have been done because you only capture men who have abused other people. Right. And so therefore you see the cause and nexus. Then when you hear their life story, their trajectory, then you find out that, yes, maybe at a young age they had been victims of abuse, whereas we don't really capture those who are not perpetrators of violence. So we don't know their story, because I do have friends of mine who have been abused, who have, I think, as a result of it, decided, no way am I going to become that person who perpetrates violence as I grow older. Sure. And that also, in a way, becomes a stigma for men, because they kind of develop this fear like, oh my gosh, am I going to be that person who perpetrates violence as I grow older?
Kamini, let's also speak a bit about the adversarial system of justice, where sometimes women in particular have to face the abuse once more, where once they are victimized the first time, say as a result of domestic abuse or rape, have to then go before the court and relate what happened to them.
Yeah.
So they end up being victimized twice over.
Yes.
How do you see this?
It is a terrible system, because what happens is that women have to relive the experience over and over again. So you call it re-victimization. And most often, in a court of law, you will find the lawyer appearing for the defendant trying to totally discredit your story and shift the blame also of the act of violence to the woman. And in Sri Lanka, the CARE study revealed how men and also women have this perception that women also are largely to blame for the experience of violence or even domestic violence. In terms of, if I were to shift to a positive story, saying, for example, in the child abuse or child protection sector, what the government has been trying to introduce is to, and it's worked in a few places and instances where the evidence is recorded, and then that is played over and over when the case comes up for trial, and it's a closed court. But it's not only the re-victimization. Let's go back to actual taking action against perpetrators of violence. And once again, this CARE study showed how only 3% of men who have perpetrated sexual violence, including rape, are held accountable or even reported.
So these figures are damning.
They are.
So what do we do about this?
What do we do is that, you know, for women, for example, it takes a lot for them to come forward and say, look, I am a victim of sexual gender-based violence. Because unfortunately, women also go through a process of self-stigmatization. We've grown up thinking that the way we behave, the way we dress, has called for a particular way of people treating us, and especially when it comes to sexual gender-based violence. I mean, even for me as a child, I remember experiencing certain things going by bus, when I was going to school by bus, and I initially would think it's my fault. So therein lies one key issue, and of course also those around you, say families, would prefer to keep it hush-hush because they're afraid of what it would do to them, to their what people would think of them and a person's future. And also, one of the other big issues is also that we know that the legal system is not really strong enough to take these things forward in a very confidential manner, and that is why you will only see women who have really been pushed to the limit who will come forward with the case.
Right.
But people I speak to, people who talk to me about their experience of violence, you know, there's so many people who have experienced it but not taken action. Right. And therein lies the issue, because men who have perpetrated violence against one woman or even child is very likely to perpetrate violence again to another woman or another child.
Do you advocate for reform in the legal system with regard to gender-based violence, Kamini?
I advocate for the implementation of various policies and procedures that have been developed.
Such as?
We have, say, for example, the Women's Bureau, the Women and Child Desk in the police stations. Those are supposed to be in a confidential area where the woman can come and speak about the issue. They're supposed to have a woman constable. It's supposed to be manned by woman constable, and that's the first point of contact for a woman. And then maintaining the confidentiality of the case is something that is supposed to be safeguarded by law. But what happens is that, for example, in the plantation sector, when a woman has experienced gender-based violence, by the time she gets to the police desk, it's closed. No one's there, and she's like spent 2 hours walking, because you know the infrastructure facilities also that are available in the plantation sector. And how is she to come back? Or say, for example, you're supposed to have a hotline. The government has a hotline 1938 for women to report their experience of violence, but unfortunately it doesn't work during the weekends and after hours. And a woman is more likely to find the space or the time to access a phone after hours.
Sure.
So what happens to her?
So what's really going wrong? I mean, there are policymakers, there are different stakeholders who are interested in making change, who are interested in bringing about positive change in this sector, but aren't they coming together properly? What is really wrong with this equation?
I feel it's a combination of mainly the attitudes of people who are involved in the process. You see, there's a high acceptance or normalization of gender-based violence in the country, period. Right. So first you need to deal with that.
So you're saying people think it's okay to be abused?
There is pretty much a normalization, as in, you know, suck it up. Take it up. It's okay. You know, you're in a relationship, you're married, like you should put up with this kind of, you know, abuse. I mean, they won't use the word abuse, but you shouldn't. What's the word? I think air your dirty linen in public.
Right.
Right. I think. And so you will see even some of the policymakers, the decision makers, they also do hold some of those values and approaches. And I also do feel that funding plays a very important role as well, in terms of our local budget.
So the budgetary allocations in this regard is not sufficient?
It's around 0.6% of the national budget.
Right.
So what do you do with it? And you see, say, for example, the Ministry of Women's Affairs, that is the key player in implementation processes and practices. They always have to reach out to the NGO community, to donors, in order to support the implementation of, say, shelters, because there's not enough money. And even in Sri Lanka, sadly, in the past few years, funding for gender-based violence and gender has gone down considerably. I would say those...
Which is ironic.
It is ironic. It is. But I do believe also we've lived in an era, and that is why data is so important. We've lived in an era where it's been brushed off as anecdotal. It's not really my issue. Where you're just making a big deal out of nothing. These women's activists always talk about these things.
On that same note, you spoke about normalizing of gender-based violence. Now, we could talk about this, but maybe someone watching us from home who is being subjected to violence would think, okay, it's easy for them to talk, but I have a family, I have a stable income, my child is being taken care of by my husband. Why would I leave this?
Yes.
What do I then have after I talk about my abuse?
Actually, that's a really good point, because economic dependency is one of the key reasons why women do not take action. You will find that in Sri Lanka, a lot of women, once they get married, they do give up their jobs and their livelihood. So as a result, they become totally dependent on the husband or the partner. And so when they do face an experience of gender-based violence, the key issue is, okay, who is going to support me? And most likely the woman is going to be the one who takes the children as well. So who's going to look after the children as well? And that becomes a key consideration. And I mean, even in my own experience with women who are victims of severe violence, they have withstood tremendous levels of abuse simply due to this reason, until they're almost... They find themselves in hospital, totally beaten up, and that's when they decide, okay, enough. I can't take this anymore because my child won't have a mother soon. And that is why also in the response to gender-based violence, it's very important to incorporate this aspect of economic empowerment, which we don't do in Sri Lanka.
Right. How does one go about doing that?
What would need to happen is that it depends also on each person, each woman, where they're at, what the
Let's take, for example, the garment sector.
Right.
How does one engaged in the garment sector do this if she is subjected to violence?
Well, if she's in the garment sector, then she is working. So therefore, it wouldn't be so much of an issue.
Right.
I find that most of the women who are working in the apparel sector are women who have left their families in the village and they are bordered in various areas. But say, for example, if you were to deal with a woman, I mean, the thing is, Sri Lanka is mainly an agriculture-based country, even though we don't talk enough about it. So a woman working in rural areas or living in rural areas, if she is a victim of gender-based violence, what you would do is to develop her skills around, okay, what interests you in terms of an economic or microfinancing project? How can you get about it? These are the skills you need. This is a startup amount you need. And
so the government needs to come forward and offer those incentives to women.
Yes, yes.
But that's not being done.
It's not being done.
It needs to be done.
It does. It does. And in other countries, these are aspects that are looked into. Because you do understand that you do need to provide this kind of support to women. But also something that is also being done in other countries, bringing us back to the perpetrator, is also rehabilitation of the perpetrator.
Sure.
We focus gender-based violence efforts so much on women.
Right.
But there's a dire need to focus on the perpetrator. And in a number of countries, there are counseling sessions, rehabilitation sessions for men who are perpetrators. And now there's a growing movement, especially of those amongst those who work on engaging men and boys to end violence against women and girls, where you're working more with young people, boys and girls, but also focusing on boys, focusing on what is it that grows a man or makes a boy become a potential perpetrator, and trying to intervene and break that cycle of violence.
Do you think that our teachers are well versed to deal with potential perpetrators?
No.
Why is that?
Because teachers play a very important role in reaffirming these norms around boys will be boys. Boys are allowed to be violent.
There are enough and more teacher training institutes across the country.
Yeah, but the thing is, I think this is an issue that also goes hand in hand with sexual and reproductive health, comprehensive sexual health education.
Sure, which we still don't have.
Which we still don't have. And if, for example, if we were to implement the comprehensive sexual health education syllabus that people have been pushing, you would have this piece of talking about gender and gender-based violence. But even before the teacher, the first influencer is home. Will be your parents and will be your relatives. A lot of people who do realize their roles as, say for example, when do you first realize that you're a girl or a boy? And it may seem like a very simple question, but for a lot of women, their experience of realizing that they're girls is a very negative experience. Say,
sure.
For example, it's because they've been withheld from playing with the boys, or they've experienced some kind of abuse. And that's when they realize the difference between themselves and a boy. Whereas for boys, it may happen much later in life. And also for girls, it's most likely their mothers, their fathers, not fathers so much, but mothers,
right.
And aunts, cousins who will reinforce this, you're a girl, this is the way you're supposed to behave. And that's where it actually starts.
Okay. So how can we expect parents to teach their children when the majority isn't really literate or educated in those terms of the word? We're talking about the plantation sector, the apparel industry, the agricultural community, who have very humble educational levels.
Yeah, that's true, and I think that's one of the biggest issues in this country, because parenting, who talks about parenting? Who teaches parents about how to be a good parent?
Sure.
And various organizations, NGOs, they do try to intervene, they do try to do programs to help parents navigate their way through their personal relationships with their partners, and also how you manage your child, how you inculcate these attitudes and behaviors amongst your children. But of course, they're far and few between. I mean, because as I said, the funding has come down so much, it's very difficult to penetrate a lot of people. And I guess this is where the government would then step in. And therein also, those who implement the work, you have to do a lot of work with their own attitudes and behaviors. What is acceptable, what is not acceptable.
Also, speaking about gender-based violence, you do a lot of work with regard to boys and men. Can you elaborate on some of these?
Yes. For me, it's been really interesting to access this area of work, because, as I said before, men are the main perpetrators of violence against women and girls. And once again, quoting the CARE study, you would see that amongst men, those who perpetrated sexual gender-based violence against women, for them around 66% perpetrated violence because of their feelings of sexual entitlement. They felt sexually entitled to sexually violate a woman.
Right.
So where does that come from? It comes from society, family, schools telling you that it's okay to behave in a particular way. You call it masculinities. These are the norms that society is okay with. And also, we found that in this study that amongst the sample size, questions were asked amongst those who had actually perpetrated rape. How old were you when you first perpetrated your first rape? And amongst the sample, 28% were within the age range of 15 to 19, youth. And then the largest percentage was 60% of the men said they perpetrated violence or sexual violence against women when they were between the ages of 20 to 30. So therein lies that key place where why you need to work with men. And also research shows how, once again, as I said before, how men who have experienced negative have had negative experience, say for example, experienced child abuse. And by the way, Sri Lanka has one of the highest child abuse rates in the region against men, against boys, because it's a shame we don't talk enough about this.
Yes.
And also those who have witnessed violence against their mothers are more likely to perpetrate violence when they grow older.
Right.
So there's a real need to break into this and to start talking about what it is to be a man, what it is to, from this age till you become an adult, what is your expression of masculinity? Are you going to make it a positive one, or are you going to make it a negative one? And also society plays an important role, because if a guy or if a boy shifts and becomes more responsible or more of an equal partner to a woman, society also sometimes isn't ready for it. But anyway, the work mainly involves working with boys and also men to change these attitudes towards masculinity, what it is to be a man. And reflecting on why it is that, say, I may choose violence versus communication, talking out an issue. How can I manage my emotions? Because if you see amongst boys the way they behave, if they're in a clique, if they're in a school, boys are expected to be violent, right? So it doesn't just stay within the school. I had an organization where we have a youth center, and we work a lot with boys and girls from the slum areas, and I see this playing out every single day, where the boys are pushed into behaving in a particular way as to what it is to be a man or what it is to be a boy. And it mainly involves violence. So it involves, say, doing things that are very high risk activities. And if they do not do it, they are bullied.
Right. Kamini, let's also talk about the psychosocial aspect of gender-based violence.
Yes. So as I said before, the studies show how boys who experience violence are more likely to perpetrate violence as they grow older.
Sure.
And it's not only the boys, even amongst girls, studies have shown, we don't have studies in Sri Lanka around this, but internationally studies show that girls who have also come from homes or have had experiences of child abuse, or who have witnessed abuse, are more likely to become victims of abuse as well, because the girls are more likely to normalize the experience, otherwise they can't cope with it. And then amongst boys you have this issue. So that is where psychosocial services become so important. And sadly, in Sri Lanka, we hardly talk about mental health. For me, when I talk about it, I'm talking about it from a way of preventing gender-based violence. But there are many.
What steps can the government take?
The government needs to provide counselors, as they were supposed to, within the schools. Provide a confidential service to kids so that they can come and talk to a counselor and get proper support to see things through. The government has also tried to establish adolescent youth clubs, which are affiliated with hospitals, which have not really worked, because young people would feel awkward to go into a hospital to access a youth center or whatever.
Yeah, sure.
So there's a need to make services really youth-friendly as well, so that young people feel comfortable. Say, for example, even my youth center, it's very much, we say that it belongs to the young people in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
And they play games, they paint, they do things which relax themselves, but also we've introduced things like art therapy, drama therapy, we do counseling, and it's not in the room counseling, you sense something is going on and then we'll talk with them. We teach them meditation, yoga, so that they have emotional management tools as well. And those are the things that need to really come in. And also, what are the things that make children feel stressed? You will see things like, growing up, puberty, bullying, educational stress. These are key things that also add on to children's stress. And addressing those issues are important. And in other countries, these things are done, which have proven to be very successful.
Right. Very quickly, another sector of society that is often subjected to gender-based violence is the transgender community in the country. How does Sri Lanka's statistics sort of display this?
In the past, the statistics were pretty bad. The transgender community feels that there has been an improvement.
Right.
A few years ago, say a decade ago, there was a really important study that came out called Dance Ponya Dance, which really showed the sexual bribes that transgender people had to deal with when it came to even the police. But now with a lot of advocacy, it's gone down a lot.
So thank you very much. I think we had a very comprehensive 30-minute discussion on the topic of gender-based violence. Thanks, Kamini Jinadasa, gender consultant, for joining us on this edition of Newsline. We'll see you again tomorrow. Have a great day.